The truth is I could talk about this stuff for multiple hours, but you got other places to be, so even allowing me the hour of time is really important, and I appreciate that. If you can't hear something or you've got questions, just throw a hand up or even feel free to kind of shout stuff out. I'm pretty informal, so we'll kind of get going here so that you can move on to other stuff. I want to start really quickly with, you probably have seen or heard of this. This is from the Madison College website. It's part of the rights and responsibilities kind of stuff. I like to start this way, not to say, hey, you have to do this or you should do this or anything like that, but to sort of remind you that these are kind of our goals, I think, for everybody here on campus. There are more rights and responsibilities, but these, as I say, are the big two. That you have the right to experience a high-quality learning environment free from disruption and distraction, and that you have the right to be treated with respect and dignity, free from harassment and or discrimination. And I really feel like these are both rights and responsibilities rolled into one. That you have a right to expect these, but also I think you have a responsibility, and particularly as student athletes, you are, whether you want to be or not, or you see yourself that way or not, you are student leaders. People look up to you. And so you have a responsibility, and the kind of tone that you set and the behavior that you exhibit really does make a difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So as we think about that moving forward, just some brief statistics. And I don't do this to scare folks or anything like that, but just to kind of make it real. And you've probably heard some of these before, that the reality is that during their college careers, about 1 in 4, 25% of college women will be victims of some kind of sexual assault. Think about that for a minute. Think about your friends, classmates, roommates, partners, whatever it might be. 1 in 4. That's kind of startling if you think about it. To go further, 9 out of 10, about 90% of those victims, of those women, report having known the perpetrator. I want to be clear kind of from the outset here, this sort of thing does happen to men as well, and I don't mean to by any means belittle that or ignore that, but the reality is most of what we know and the kind of the core of the problem is talking about women being victimized here. Okay? So again, 90% of those folks have known the perpetrator. So, you know, that image of the woman sort of walking alone and getting pulled into a dark alley by some stranger, yes, that happens on occasion, and it's no less tragic, certainly, but that's not the scenario that we're talking about most of the time. A large proportion, studies seem to vary, I couldn't get a hard and fast number here, but a large proportion of these attacks occur on what people think of as on a date, okay? So that means that, you know, again, this involves people you know on one side or the other, situations that you know and are used to sort of seeing. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Okay? You may have heard somewhere along the line of something called the Kitty Genovese story. The gist of it really quickly, in 1964, there was a young woman named Kitty Genovese. She worked as a bartender, actually. She was walking home, and she was raped and murdered. This actually was one of those occasions where it appears to have been just a random stranger, not somebody that she knew. The media at the time, and again, this was 1964, so it was before Twitter, it was before a million, 24-hour cable news channels, but newspapers, the news reports on TV and stuff, they reported that 38 people were witness to this, and that nobody did anything. Now, it turns out that that's not quite the real story. I'll get a little bit more of the details on that later. But one of the things that came out of this was research on, well, how could that happen? How could 38 people see this horrible crime and not do anything? And it led to this research called the bystander intervention and the bystander effect. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it sort of looks at why is it that in some cases people do try to help, and why is it that in some cases don't? Because understanding kind of why that is and how that is can help us be more helpful in the present. So, as I said, why focus on bystanders? Well, think about it, right? There are a relatively small number of victims, still far too many, obviously, but, relative to the population, a relatively small number of victims, an even smaller number of perpetrators, and what that tells us is that the men, most often men, not always, but the people who are perpetrating tend to be repeat offenders, as it were, right? They're perpetrating this crime against a relatively small number of victims, and the bigger number in the population are the rest of us. bystanders in some way, shape, or form. We may not literally be there as it happens, as in the Kitty Genovese case, but in some way, shape, or form, we are bystanders. So why not go after this group so that we can figure out what can we do to help prevent this, right? We need, as I said, we need to recognize the conditions where people could be victimized. And I want to be careful here, and you can certainly, if you have issue with this, please let me know. It's not about sort of blaming the victim so much as understanding, well, what are the circumstances? How do these things happen so that we can all make good choices to help prevent it? As Einstein, pretty smart guy, certainly smarter than I am, said the world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. And again, that is most often the rest of us, right? My guess, nobody in this room is probably evil, and if there are evil people in the room, it's what, like one of us or something statistically? Heck, maybe it's me, right? It's not the evil people so much as the people, the rest of us, who don't do anything about it. Okay? And again, you're campus leaders, so you have an opportunity to help prevent that. So, again, why is it that people don't seem to get involved, right? There's been lots of research, again, started because of this Kitty Genovese case, where they found that people don't tend to help out, right? There's this notion of the bystander effect, where they found that people don't help out even though they're seeing something happen. And they've done this a million different times. They do it with, usually silly little inconsequential things, like they'll have somebody, you may have even inadvertently seen one of these studies happening, where they'll have it's not a real victim, but they'll have someone walking by with a load of papers, and the person will drop the papers, and they wait and see, does anybody come and help me or not, right? And most often they find people don't come and help, right? As it says, help is actually less likely as the number of bystanders increase. So they sometimes do this, like in elevators or whatnot. I'll drop my papers, and if I'm there with one other person, there's a decent chance that person's going to help me pick it up, versus if it's a really crowded elevator or space, whatever it might be, and I drop my papers and there are lots of people, most people are going to kind of look away, pretend not to notice, whatever it is. And some of the reasons for that: ambiguity. Is it clear that there's an actual need for help? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Cohesiveness. How close are the bystanders? If it's a group that's all friendly together, they actually tend to be more likely to help, versus if they're complete strangers, there's this kind of, well, someone else will do it. And that's the third part, this diffusion of responsibility. Oh, someone else will probably help, or somebody else is maybe more qualified to do this. All these things are natural kind of phenomenon. The trick is, how do we overcome that? All right, these are reasons, but I hope they won't be excuses. So how do we overcome it? Well, it's actually a question of both how and when. And we need to kind of break it into those two pieces, because depending on, they both impact each other. How we do it depends on when we're intervening, and when we're intervening may depend on what kind of options we have, the how of intervening. So I want to start with kind of a how and why issue, because this sort of supersedes all of that. This idea of perspective taking. Who's seen this picture before in a textbook in a class? Okay, a couple of you. It's a famous illusion. For those who haven't maybe seen it before, you can kind of get your head to flip back and forth. So some people look at this and they see some sort of like vase or something, the black part here in the middle. Other people, they'll look at this and they see two white faces looking like they're going to, I guess, kiss each other, or making smoochy faces at each other. And most people are able to switch back and forth between those two images, but it takes a second. Not like it takes a lot of energy, but it takes a second. You kind of got to make almost like you're flipping a switch in your brain, right? And I point that out to note that this is what it takes to take perspective in other more important situations, right? We have to think about it for a minute. Imagine, how does this other person think? How does this other person feel? What would I want to do or want to be done if I were in the same situation? Imagining, how would I like it? How would I feel? That takes some work. Even for those of us who are good at it, it can take a little bit of work, and some of us tend to just be sort of naturally better at it than others. It takes some work, it takes some practice. So just like you need to switch your brain to see the two different images, you need to switch your brain to do some perspective taking. But I encourage you to do so, because that is really the biggest part of being an effective helper, an effective bystander. Okay? So back to the issue of when. Right? And just to sort of read this quote to you really quickly. When we consider stopping sexual violence, we usually think of intervening in individual acts of child sexual abuse or rape, but rarely is the individual act the only opportunity to intervene. Rather, there are literally hundreds of little comments, harassments, and other forms of abuse that lead up to what we think of as the sexually violent act. And this is important, right? You know, we see in movies, TV shows, or whatever, sometimes the hero swoops in at the last second and, you know, punches the potential offender or whatever. And those kinds of things happen, I guess, on occasion. But what I want to tell you in a sense is that's too late. Or maybe not too late, but that's later than we should be intervening in some ways. There are things that led up to that event or those events. And if we start thinking about, okay, what led up to that, we can prevent things from even getting that far and from kind of getting out of hand. There's this continuum that I like to think about, and this isn't an exact thing, but it's a good way to think about what we're talking about, right? And a continuum is just sort of a, you know, a scale from one end to the other. And on one end, we have sort of healthy, age-appropriate, mutually respectful, and safe. That's what we would sort of hope that all sexual encounters, romantic encounters for that matter, are. We would hope that they're healthy, that they're age-appropriate, they're respectful, they're safe, everybody involved is giving consent. That's what we would sort of want, and that's on one end of things, and that's sort of what we consider good behavior, right? On the other end are things that are clearly sexually abusive and violent, and what we think of as rape or child molestation or other horrible kinds of things. But the reality is there's some gray area in there. A lot of people don't like to think about gray area. It makes things more confusing, right? You know, so take something that's, you know, maybe mutually flirtatious and playful, right? It's maybe not clear. That time when, you know, you're out at the bar or the club or wherever it is, and you're sort of making eyes and talking and, you know, or sending texts back and forth, whatever. It's playful. No one's quite sure where it's going or what the limits are. You know, well, this other person seems to like me. I'm kind of interested in them, but I don't know how far it's going to go, right? It's generally okay until someone maybe pushes it too far, right? Then there could be sort of age inappropriate or non-mutual, right? Somebody's flirting with someone who's underage or isn't interested in that kind of attention, right? And there's sort of the harassment, the continued, hey, come on, why don't you go out with me, you know, whatever, where they're, you know, they haven't gotten necessarily violent yet or anything like that, but it's really unwanted attention, right? So there's this whole continuum, and we can intervene anywhere along that line, and if we recognize that, it helps increase our options. So, just a little scenario made up, right? Okay, so Megan, she's 25 years old, she works at a local food store, right? Her boss, Mark, is 39, and often makes sexually inappropriate jokes around the staff. Sort of tells dirty jokes, or makes comments about what people are wearing, that kind of thing. We've all seen that person or heard of that person. Most people tend to ignore Mark, right? One day, Mark begins to flirt with a 16-year-old customer in the store, right? Maybe she came in to buy some groceries for the family, whatever it is. He's kind of flirting with her, right? When she leaves, Mark laughs, and he asks Megan if she thinks it's okay. Since it's only flirting, right? He's not doing anything. He's just, you know, commenting on how she looks, or, you know, oh, hey, if you were older, we could, you know, whatever, those kinds of things, right? Faced with the question, Megan says, it's not okay. I don't think it's healthy for anyone who's 39 years old to send a sexual message to a 16-year-old girl, right? So Megan took a stand in this case, which is not without risks, right? Mark is her boss. Mark could fire her, or could give her crappy shifts, or whatever. So she took a pretty brave risk here, and that may or may not be something that you would want to do. But even so, if you think about it, who else, I was sort of asked, anybody else in this, and I know this is vague, but who else might have intervened, might have done something, said something? Other people in the store, other coworkers. I heard someone say customers, right? The girl herself, perhaps. I mean, it might have been difficult, but right, there are lots of other people. And just to sort of give you a sense, and this is by no means exhaustive here, but right, this sort of paints a potential universe here, right? There's Mark, our perpetrator. There's Megan. There's our 16-year-old girl, our victim, right? And again, this is by no means exhaustive, but lots of other people, right? So somebody mentioned customers could have said something. You know, a customer could have come over and said, I've been shopping in this store for years. Are you the manager here? That's disgusting. How dare you talk to a young woman like that? Right? I'm not going to shop here anymore until you're fired, or whatever. Could have said something. Coworkers could have all gotten together and had Megan's back, or all sort of come together. Maybe one of those in a staff meeting, somebody said, hey, Mark, you know, you're a good guy, but you know that sometimes these things you say, they're just not okay, especially around customers, right? Presumably Mark has family. I notice in the book that I got this from, it indicates Mark doesn't have friends. Wonder why. He kind of seems like a sleazy guy, right? But maybe Mark does have friends, right? They could have said something, or his family, you know, maybe his brother, his sister, his whatever, could have said, Mark, whoa, dude, take it down a notch. It's creepy, right? You're nearly 40 years old. You can't be talking to young girls that way, right? The owners who hired Mark, maybe they noticed something, right? And people certainly could have, you know, supported Megan in other ways. So again, this is not to show you that there's one particular way, but rather to highlight that there are lots of different ways to intervene to help people out, to be protective of this girl, right? Maybe, as just one other example, right, Megan took a pretty brave stand to talk to Mark, you know, right kind of there in public. That might be risky. That might not be something you want to do. Maybe maybe you have a job. Maybe you need that job to pay for school, to pay for other kinds of things, right? So maybe another option would have been Megan could have kind of walked out and talked to the girl afterwards and said, hey, look, the way Mark talked to you, that was inappropriate. I am so sorry that happened. You know, I'm going to try to find a time to talk to him so that he'll stop doing that, and he won't do that to you, and he won't do that to other young women, right? So that might have been an option that might have been more protective of her job, but still help the girl feel a little less victimized, a little sort of taken care of, right? So there are lots of different options and ways to intervene. Because again, no one's asking you to put on the superhero cape and come in and put yourself at risk either of physical danger or even in a case like this of losing your job. You know, again, if you choose to do that and really take a stand, that can be a great thing, but that may not be the smartest thing for you to do.